One of the things about the present world situation is that the traditional thinking about revolution seems a little outmoded. The notion that we can have a proletarian revolution is not something that is on the agenda of very many people anymore. And especially here in Hong Kong, where I think Marxist studies aren't very highly emphasized. The question would be, what are the hopes, what are the directions for possible change? Marxist analysis has placed its emphasis and its hopes on the organization of the proletariat as the revolutionary class. But the change in economic structures and the change in financial structures worldwide has disorganized, has dispersed the working peoples so that most of them no longer feel that they are part of the universal working class, the international working class. And so with that, many people have thought that that may mean that the possibilities of revolutionary change have also vanished or diminished strongly. So the question that we pose in this paper is there a new revolutionary actor? Are there revolutionary actors around the world today that are no longer integrated into the proletarian structure of exploitation that Karl Marx talked about more than 150 years ago? If there is such an actor, if there are such actors, where do they come from and how are they organized? And what is the political, philosophical, and ideological base for revolutionary action today? As I was thinking about this presentation this morning in the light of our previous days here, one of the words that was not highly mentioned in our seminar for the past few days is revolution. And that seems to me to be a shame. That seems to me to be a tragedy. Because if we are really talking about sustainability and transformation, we must be talking about revolution. So there is a need for a new revolutionary actor. Where do we find such a revolutionary actor? What I argue in this paper is that we will not find the revolutionary actor within capitalism. Capitalism is no longer simply a mode of production. Capitalism is a mechanism for changing people's ways of thinking. Capitalism, as has always been, is an organization of society based on alienation. But this alienation today is much more profound than the alienation that took place over the past 100 years or so. Because this alienation is no longer simply a problem of the workplace. This alienation is profoundly arraigado, rooted, profoundly rooted in people's thinking about themselves. And we can see that no better than here in Hong Kong, where you have buildings that are 50 stories high, 50 levels high. You have families that live in these gigantic towers and spend huge amounts of time and money going from home to work and getting very tired in the process. And between the trip, between home and work, all you see are signs for consumption. And perhaps many of the people who make those trips don't have enough money to be able to consume. Certainly in the rest of the world, which is not as prosperous as Hong Kong, consumption is just a dream. And so the new revolutionary actor requires a balance, a new kind of balance of social and political transformation. And I, in this presentation, argue that it requires thinking about its origins in post-capitalist societies. The question that everyone asks me is, there are no post-capitalist societies because we all live in capitalism. So how can we have a post-capitalist society, which is the hope for social transformation, for revolution, if we have to wait until the post-capitalist society to come? And what I and the group that I work with in Mexico, along with many others in Latin America, argue is that's wrong. Those post-capitalist societies still exist right now. They are stronger than they have ever been in history, and they are conscious of their revolutionary role to transform society, to transform the world, and, by the way, save the planet. Because it's not just society that they're involved in. They are also involved in saving the planet. Let's go to the next. The revolution, in the traditional Marxist sense of the word, involved a fundamental change in power structures that was anchored in a scientific and technological revolution. But the revolution in Marxist thought involved not only the scientific and technological revolution, but it also requires a transformation of social life. And that is extraordinarily important. And so the question in the Marxist tradition is, what is a class? And the Marxist tradition involved a structure which basically said that eventually all people will be assimilated into two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But we know today that that's not historically accurate. In fact, most of the world's population today is not a member of the global proletariat. And I think that that's a very important thing to think about. And I'm particularly struck by that here at Lingnan University, because here you have cultural studies. You have a whole department of cultural studies. How much of your cultural studies is informed by the relationship of the people to the class to which they belong? Do you have in your structure of cultural studies a clear differentiation of what it means to be a proletarian or what it means to be unable to be a proletarian? That is a very profound problem today, since most of the world's population can never become proletarian. In Mexico and Latin America, people say that it's really terrible to be exploited. But most people say, but many other people say, but I would like to become exploited because in my present situation, I just live in poverty. And if I were exploited, at least I would have a salary. And that's a contradiction in terms today, isn't it? Because much of the world's population lives below the level of human existence. So the revolutionary class historically was the proletarian, and it was the proletarians fighting for its rights. It's the proletariat struggling to improve its conditions against the world bourgeoisie that was the motive force for revolutionary transformation. But if most of the world's population is no longer proletarian, and because the state has now become the bourgeoisie, or the actor of the bourgeoisie, then revolutionary action itself involves military defeat. And so the question then becomes, where do we move from here? Historically, the revolution was a question of the proletarian taking power. There was a debate in Marxism, there still is a debate in Marxism, about whether that power has to be taken at the back of a gun or whether it can be taken by political force, through elections, through institutional change. That was a question that is linked to what is the relationship of people to the state. And that is a very complex theoretical methodological question, which we would argue is less important today than in the past because the proletarian itself is not the main revolutionary actor. And so the question is, the revolutionary system in traditional Marxist thought was a traditional force for change, but if it is no longer the main social actor, then where does it come from? The problem that Marxism posed, of course, as you all know, maybe, is that alienation itself was a driving force for revolutionary change. Alienation in the workplace, which created class consciousness. But today, alienation perhaps comes in the shopping malls, in the consumption process. And the enemy is no longer your employer, but it is society itself. The question then is, in the historical Marxist tradition, the question was, how do you take state power? And we are going to argue in this paper, I better go faster, right? We are going to argue in this paper that taking state power itself perhaps is not the main social dynamic that is involved in social change. And what we will argue, what I do argue, and what I would like to suggest for the discussion is post-capitalist societies are the breeding ground for revolutionary actors, and these post-capitalist societies are composed of indigenous, rural, and peasant communities. This is I want to emphasize, this is a very strong statement. Why is it a strong statement? Because if these are the revolutionary actors, and most of the world lives in cities, most of the world lives in 50-story gigantic apartment blocks and doesn't know their neighbors and has to buy the food in an alienated, unhealthy situation, is most of the world's population excluded from the possibility of revolutionary change? That is a very, very strong question, which I would argue our global university must confront. Post-capitalist societies, which are, we're arguing, the basis, the context for revolutionary actors, today is possible because these people understand better than any time in history what capitalism is about. They have been exploited for generations by capitalism. They have been excluded, and when included, they have been badly treated. They decided, these post-capitalist societies are explicitly deciding to collectively not continue within the logic of capitalism. These post-capitalist societies are societies that are controlling their own means of production. And what does that mean? It means not only that they know how to produce, but they control territory. And I want to emphasize the word territory. Controlling territory today is extraordinarily important. So it means, again, that there is a direct conflict between urban peoples that do not control territory, that cannot control territory, and the possibility of revolutionary change within urban society. These post-capitalist societies exercise power within their territories, but not in the state. They are choosing to deliberately move to the margins of society. They are choosing to avoid a direct confrontation with the state, and therefore they are choosing to become involved in exercising power by managing their territory, by managing the productive system, and by managing a new form of social organization. These are dynamic societies that have and are developing explicitly a new collective consciousness, a consciousness which is firmly rooted in history, in tradition. But it is not a tradition based upon accepting what is, but using what has been to make what will be. I hope that that expression is clear. Using what has been to construct what will be. The post-capitalist societies are revolutionary actors. They're revolutionary actors because they embody the 5 basic principles, and I want to emphasize these 5 basic principles for post-capitalist societies and for revolutionary change. These 5 principles are autonomy, which means self-governance, but autonomy also means self-knowledge. It means not only that you want to govern yourself, but that you have the knowledge and the ability to learn how to manage your territory. This is combined with a basic commitment to social solidarity on a global scale. That means that the communities, the post-capitalist societies, do not operate individually, but depend upon alliances among themselves within their own regions and increasingly on a global scale to create the possibilities of revolutionary change. On a productive note, these are societies which, to the extent possible, provide their own basic needs, self-sufficiency. But I want to emphasize, to the extent possible. This was a debate that we have had with many revolutionary societies over the past 40, 50 years in which I have had the opportunity and the privilege to involve myself in debate. In Cuba, can Cuba produce the food it needs? The answer is no. A tropical island country is not possible of producing all of the food it needs. So it must develop social solidarity on a global scale. In the 1980s, here's a controversial frame, North Korea had a proposal, had a strategy of self-sufficiency. And they increased their production of food extraordinarily, while also increasing housing and social services. But it came at a tremendous cost. The Ubuntu villages, which were mentioned the other day in South Africa, specifically in Kenya, under the leadership of Jomo Kenyatta, also attempted village self-sufficiency. And they came to limits about how much they could do that. But as those societies have all learned, they can become they can increase their revolutionary strength by not insisting on full self-sufficiency, but on solidarity with their neighbors and with their partners. And that involves then productive diversification, the 4th principle on the screen. So that you not try to do everything yourself, but you try to work on political, social, and productive relationships to enrich your ability to meet your own needs and to take care of your environment, but also trade with your partners. And finally, of course, any revolutionary society today must explicitly talk about the sustainable management of its regional resources. I am not going to go further into these 5 principles now. In some of my articles in the Global University readers, not for this conference, but for other texts, you will find a great deal of discussion of these principles. The subject, the revolutionary subject that is born and reproduced within the community is a very different person than the revolutionary subject that most of you think about. Because the revolutionary subject in a post-capitalist society puts community over individual. What does that mean? For those of you who are social scientists, not very many here, for those of you who are social scientists, it means rejecting the social contract of the French Revolution. It means rejecting the Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau social contract. I would invite the people here to think about what it means to reject the Western social contract. What does it mean to reject that contract? It means that you reject the primacy of the individual over the society. It means that you have a responsibility to act responsibly, to act properly within your society, to even engage in debate with your society. But once your society has made a decision about how to move forward, you have the obligation to move forward without that society, and you may not oppose that direction. This is an extraordinarily important point that I will bring up again when we talk about the Zapatista revolution. The individual does not lose her identity, but her identity is formed and shaped within the context of the community. I am stating social principles here which are extraordinarily complex and very hard to translate. But when we heard the other day about the extraordinary efforts in Rojava among the Kurds, we have the opportunity to see the way in which a revolution and a community which is practicing many of these principles is translating it into the way in which the individual's role in society is transformed. The community, therefore, has the obligation to define common values, respect individual values, but only insofar as they do not betray collective values. Of course, if you think about this critically, you understand that that's not possible in a society in which there is a bourgeoisie. Because a bourgeoisie is based upon an egotistical pursuit of individual gain at the expense of the collectivity. I could go on about how the community promotes social virtues of fraternity and solidarity. And I think that there is nothing more important today than to talk about what it means to be a social solidarity economy. But that is only part of what would be a social solidarity society, which is the revolutionary society. In this context, community control of livelihood means that individuals may not produce whatever they want, and individuals may not sell whatever they want. And it means, therefore, that individuals may not consume whatever they want. In the societies in which I collaborate, have the privilege of collaborating, in Mexico, some of them have decided, for example, to prohibit the sale of soda pop, of Coca-Cola, and all those other kinds of products. They have decided that they will not permit the sale of white bread like the kind we're being served at breakfast here. They will not permit the use of resources for junk food. But how can you tell a child? How do you tell a child you can't have those sweets if everyone in the other communities has them? That's the extraordinary structure of the difficulty and the complexity of constructing a post-capitalist society in a capitalist world. How do you build a new kind of livelihood? How do you build a new kind of productive system which says we will not use certain technologies? How do you construct a world in which we will not allow people to do what other people in the world around them are doing? These are the complex questions that are involved in a revolutionary construction. And it means also, as the Zapatistas have shown in Mexico, it even means rethinking what it means to be in love. There are beautiful films that come out of Mexico, revolutionary Mexico today, which ask the question, how do young people have a romance? How do you make a choice between having a romance as a young couple and having a romance as part of a revolutionary movement? There's a beautiful film about that, which title in English is called The Time of the Heart, and poses directly that question. And it's extraordinarily complex question. And it's beautiful that that film, which emerged from the jungles of Chiapas, suggests that question. But 40 years ago, a similar kind of film, not about love, was made and became an important world movie, and it was called The Death of a Bureaucrat. How do you have a government servant, a government functionary, work in a post-capitalist society? How do you transform a bureaucratic function into a revolutionary function? The Death of a Bureaucrat is something I would recommend you all look at. It's available freely on YouTube. But it involves collective decision-making. But I want to emphasize something else that is extraordinarily important and perhaps is misunderstood. These are not subsistence societies. These are not poor societies. These are societies that are learning that they can produce wealth. And they can transform what economists call surplus into collective social and planetary well-being. And I want to emphasize, I don't have time to go into it now, that the extraordinary success of the post-capitalist societies that are flourishing around the world are societies that know how to organize the production of surplus, are societies that know how not only to produce surplus, but to make sure that that surplus is used constructively for the benefit of the people in their region, as well as for the planet. The function of surplus is very, very important. because many people think of peasant societies and indigenous societies as subsistence societies. And I would argue that one of the extraordinary lessons that we have learned from post-capitalist societies is that unlike capitalist societies, they are interested in producing surplus only to the extent that it's necessary for planetary and social well-being, and not for anything else. So if you have surplus, then you do have growth. And I want to talk about that because some of you are involved in a worldwide discussion now about a political line of thinking that comes from Europe, which I believe is completely retrograde. And that's called degrowth. The degrowth people are arguing that we have to do is stop growing. And I would argue that what we have to do is rethink the way in which we grow, not to stop growing. Because there are too many environmental and social needs that need to be satisfied so that we can simply get off the growth wagon. I am exaggerating my opposition to the degrowth because it is so politically attractive in first world societies today. There is a very large degrowth community in China right now, not very popular in the Communist Party. And in my own country in September, we will have an international conference on degrowth that will happen right before an international conference that I am organizing on ecological economics. And we are going to counterpose degrowth to post-capitalist well-being. This is extraordinarily important. In today's world, there are three ways of thinking about the way in which we have revolutionary change. One would be the global revolution. Two would be a multiple revolutions, but local revolutions that somehow are taken out of their context. And the third, which I am arguing for, the forms of revolutionary transformation which we argue for would be fundamentally anchored in an environmental social transformation that is based upon the construction of post-capitalist societies, the leadership of post-capitalist societies. It means, and I can't emphasize this enough, it means something extraordinarily important. The global revolution, in the sense that I am talking about, is not a single revolution, but it is an extraordinary potpourri, is an extraordinary mixture, mélange of colors, of cultures, of ways of thinking about how people live together. The revolutionary transformation of post-capitalist societies will then expand, and here is my basis for hope in the future. These revolutionary societies, which are indigenous, which are rural, which are peasant-based, will not remain isolated from their urban masses, but in fact will depend upon incorporating urban groups that are looking for improving and changing their style of life, their quality of life, their way of relating to other people, so that the urban people who become revolutionary comrades in arms, these urban comrades in arms will become then producers of a different kind of urban society also. But we anticipate that that is a long time in the future because of the alienation of urban consumption capitalism. To end up, before the 5 minutes that I've been allotted, the creation of a post-capitalist revolutionary society involves a very hard choice for those of us who want to participate. A very hard choice for those who have already made that decision to become part of that global movement. Because it involves resistance in everyday life at all points in time. The global capitalist system is a very powerful ideological and material mechanism. Gilberto lived it yesterday. He lost his cell phone. And he was not worried so much about the phone as all the information about his life that was in the phone. He said, I'll have to rebuild my life. We can laugh about that now that we have found where his phone is. But it's true. How many of you can unplug? How many of you know what it would mean to unplug? I remember the first day I was here, and I asked some of the young people who were opening cans of Coca-Cola at this conference, why are you even allowed to have Coca-Cola in a conference on sustainability? And one of the interesting things was the young people hadn't thought about that, really. So, resistance, revolutionary change to construct and to collaborate with post-capitalist societies is something that requires struggle. Individual struggle by each one of us to think about what it would mean. It does not mean it is not sufficient to become a vegetarian. It is not sufficient to recycle your garbage. It is not sufficient to have a community center and to be a good parent, because resistance and collaboration in the revolution with post-capitalist societies requires something much, much more thoroughgoing. It involves placing your individual welfare at the hands of the community of which you are a part. And how many of us today are in fact able to even identify the community of which we are a part? It involves a constant, at this point in history, rebellion. But it involves something else, and that's the last line in this slide. It involves an idea of what the world you are constructing looks like and will look like. It involves a model of what you can live on. It involves a model in which the environmental crisis will not destroy you. It involves, therefore, a model in which you will live in a corner of the world that in one way or another is isolated from the global market, because the global market will destroy you. It involves, therefore, a recognition that history must be relearned. And it has to be learned in a different way than ever before, because the history we have all learned is the history of the conquerors. The history we have to learn is the history of the people. Thank you.